class. What I want to talk to you about today in the topic of motivation and emotion is the underlying motivation that begins in the hypothalamus that produces changes in hunger. In terms of where hunger fits in motivation and emotion, this diagram from figure 8.2 in your textbook shows you that it fits at the base of the triangle under physiological needs. The way the hypothalamus works to produce hunger motivation is that it appears to have two properties, two areas of it. The lateral hypothalamus, which seems to be the accelerator on feeding behavior, like the accelerator in your car, stimulate it and the car goes. And the ventromedial hypothalamus, which seems like the brake on the car. Stimulate that and the car stops. Now, the opposite is also true. If you destroy or block the lateral hypothalamus, then the animal seems to lose the urge to eat and indeed can starve to death in the presence of food. If you damage the ventromedial hypothalamus, then the idea is that the animal loses its satiety signal and never is satisfied and eats into obesity and gets very, very fat. Now, this fundamental lateral medial hypothalamus feeding motivation was important to psychology because it connected motivation to the brain. Indeed, this was what was called the field of physiological psychology back in the old days, and now we call it behavioral neuroscience. As a small point, I just wanted to point out that in 1985, I published a book with my father, Elliot Steller, on the topic of the hypothalamus and other brain areas associated not only with feeding motivation, but also with things like reward and addiction. So the bottom line conclusion seems to be that we have something in our brain sort of like a seesaw. If you stimulate hunger, then the seesaw tips this way, satiety goes down and hunger goes up. And if you stimulate satiety, then hunger goes down and satiety goes up, and indeed the lateral and the medial hypothalamus interact with each other with inhibition, thereby showing that there is this mechanism for balancing them. Does this apply to us today in syndromes like obesity and anorexia nervosa, where people sometimes starve themselves virtually to death? The answer is given in page 264 in the textbook, where they mention this field, but then point out that there are many other brain areas up and down the brain axis that are connected, that have an influence on the hypothalamus and on this syndrome. And so we're still figuring it out. But certainly the hypothalamus lies at the base in the mammalian brain of the motivation to eat or not, which is then elaborated by higher brain circuits into the syndromes that we see in humans.